Doge versus USAID has just become the showdown of the century, and one which will likely define the Trump presidency going forward. The US Supreme Court has just given USAID a win by ordering that the roughly $2 billion in frozen USAID funding must be unfrozen. But that win is likely to be short lived because they also just upped the stakes in the Doge versus USAID heavyweight title fight and made the utter destruction of USAID, and specifically the imprisoning of those responsible for the fraud, priority number one for Doge. My name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project. I help people like you to understand the world as it changes around us, and things are changing fast in this Doge versus USAID title fight. Follow me here because there is a little bit going on. Trump and Musk targeted USAID for budget savings because of suspected fraud and generally poor value to the taxpayer from their billions in annual spending. Once they started digging, things were worse than they thought, so they moved to shut the whole thing down and, crucially, freeze the spending until such time as they could figure out what was legitimate and what was fraud. They fired a bunch of USAID workers, they put a bunch more onto administrative leave, froze the money, and began picking through the records to figure out what was what. And that's where the trouble began. Some of the USAID workers sued to keep their jobs and lost, but some of the funding recipients sued to get their money and won. Keep in mind that in the US judicial system, you can pretty much shop for a friendly judge by choosing where you lodge your case. So this kind of judicial activism via judge selection is pretty common. The case centered around a thing called the Administrative Procedure Act and didn't claim that the president couldn't stop the funding. It claimed that he couldn't do it the way he did. They shopped for their judge very well, and they got the outcome they expected. The funding freeze was itself frozen, and President Trump had to take it to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court in the US is a mess, in my opinion. The judges are appointed by presidents because having your most important legal disputes decided by people who are politically appointed, couldn't possibly go wrong now, could it? It is worth noting, however, that actually the current Supreme Court should be expected to be pretty friendly to Trump, because he made a few of those appointments himself during his first term. However, things didn't go well, with a 5-4 split decision against the funding freeze, essentially rubber stamping this decision by that mere district court judge, forcing the USA to spend $2 billion, whether it likes it or not, whilst knowing full well that a lot of it is fraud and we just don't know exactly which is which. As is normal with a split decision, the dissenting judges, the ones who didn't agree with the majority, have written their own opinion, and it is pretty scathing. I'll read the opening paragraph from the written dissent by Justice Alito. Justice Alito, with whom Justice Thomas, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Kavanaugh join, dissenting from the denial of the application to vacate order. Does a single district court judge who likely lacks jurisdiction have the unchecked power to compel the government of the United States to pay out, and probably lose forever, $2 billion taxpayer dollars? The answer to that question should be an emphatic no, but a majority of this court apparently thinks otherwise. I am stunned. End quote. In the polite legalese language that these things are usually written in, that is scathing. And we should all be stunned. We would be if it weren't for the fact that judicial activism has become so normal, especially in the US. This decision is essentially a letter of the law based decision, which agrees that it is likely that Trump really did break the Administrative Procedure Act in the way that he froze the funding. But this is a classic example of the letter of the law violating its own spirit, because now that Administrative Procedure Act, which is supposed to ensure that everything is done properly and in order, is being used as cover for outright fraud, which is most definitely not properly and in order. It's a violation of all kinds of other laws, which are far more serious than the Administrative Procedures Act itself. Justice Alito summarized the district court's decision as based their decision on a finding that respondents are likely to succeed in showing that the government violated the Administrative Procedures Act. So they probably didn't cross their T's and dot their I's correctly in the way that this funding was frozen. But also you have to keep in mind that Doge is likely to succeed in showing that many of the recipients of that funding are fraudulent. And stopping that fraud requires an immediate freeze to the funding, which doesn't leave time to cross your T's and dot your I's, which then in turn violates the Administrative Act. So now, the letter of the law in the Administrative Act is being used to uphold and protect a multi-billion-dollar international money laundering operation funded by US taxpayers. Great. But whilst many Democrats have jumped on this decision as proof that Trump is recklessly lawless and that Doge is failing, they should be careful about celebrating too soon, because what they've done is guarantee that criminal charges will be brought swiftly by the Department of Justice against everyone suspected of fraud in relation to USAID. And that's not just my opinion, that's according to Pete Morocco, USAID's Deputy Administrator Designate, who briefed members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Wednesday. Representative Keith Self was present in the briefing and divulged some details, including that, quote, they intend to refer USAID officials to DOJ, end quote, and that both USAID officials and the grant recipients would be in the firing line if found guilty of fraud. He went on to stress that you need a good paper trail to prove fraud, which is absolutely true, and so the cases prosecuted will be the ones they believe they can prove. So, chances are there will be people who committed fraud and will get away with it because there's not enough paper trail. But here's the thing. The credibility of Doge can be 100% restored and these activist judges given a proper slapdown just as soon as criminal convictions for fraud are achieved against USAID. It's no longer just about justice for these cases of fraud. This is now about Doge versus USAID, and in fact, it's about the credibility of the whole Doge project itself. So in summary, don't believe these gloating headlines about how Doge has failed or about how the USAID fraud was all a lie. Just because one activist district judge said they had to make the payments anyway, doesn't mean the fraud isn't there. This has a lot further to run, and I suspect the people in the USAID who are guilty of fraud will come to rue the day when they made their own criminal convictions the sole and central focus of this Doge versus USAID title fight. As the old adage goes, the best laid battle plans rarely survive first contact with the enemy. In other words, the Doge project was never going to go smoothly. Those guilty of fraud and those on the receiving end of the corrupt money were never just going to roll over. They weren't just going to put their hands up and say, oh, you caught me, and go quietly into the night. They are fighting back, and these deep state swamp creatures, by their nature, know how to play the game. This is exactly the reason why I argued before Trump's inauguration that he needed to move fast to drain the swamp, because these swamp creatures are experts at slowing things down and dragging things out, and they will try and delay and outwait Trump, protecting their little swamp kingdom until the 4 years are up and they hope to have a friendlier president in the future. And to my delight, Trump has been moving fast. He's done exactly what he needed to do. And so he now has plenty of time to have the DOJ prosecute fraud in USAID, get those criminal convictions, and then use that as a weapon against anyone who stands in his way. Yes, that'll probably take a year to happen, but my point is, we're only 6 weeks in, and already Trump, Doge, and the DOJ can see what needs to be done, and they still have time to do it. Trump learned a lot from his first arguably failed term as president, and woe betide anyone who thinks they can play games with him this time and win. Let round 2 of the Doge versus USAID title fight begin. My name's Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and I help people like you to understand the world as it changes around you. Leave me a like, subscribe, comment, follow me via @TopherField on all my socials, and you can grab my books and merch from goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. And I'll see you in the next video.